We are we're fucking yawning in the beginning of this shit. Okay, this will not be a yawner. I'm gonna be talking with Phil Zio. I'm posting about this right now to my Facebook, so prepare to be annoyed by being tagged in yet another Jeremy Harding post.
Some of us are used to it by now.
Yeah, right? Yeah, I mean, everybody's been on Facebook with me for a while has probably been tagged at least once, unless I'm related to them. I kind of leave them out of my politics.
It's probably a good idea.
But yeah, so this is another episode of State Smash Podcast, which I will be making an actual podcast very soon. Make sure to head over to my Facebook where I just tag this guy and send him a friend request so that he can get some more perspectives. And be sure to check out the Patreon link in the description, which I'm about to post. HTTPS. I type this stuff out like I should just have a list of links to fucking cut and paste, but I don't. It's all right though, because people are coming in right now, and so like it's sort of better. This gives them time to show up so that they can start posting questions in the comments. So, this production is brought to you by Brave Browser, the ad-resistant, tracker-resistant browsing experience. I'm calling it that now because I've had a few ads pop up anyway. I'm sure they're working on that, and I think they're working on getting a way to do it that doesn't involve completely eliminating scripting. You know, because AdBlock Plus, for instance, has a public cloud of shit that they do that with, but you know, don't want to get too lost in the weeds right there, but they have a creator program and they have a basic attention token, which is a cryptocurrency that you can send to me if you like what I'm doing with this show. Additionally, I will get basic attention tokens if you decide to download Brave. So feel free to download that, improve your ad resistant browsing experience, and additionally help the show keep on doing what it's doing. There's a Patreon link in the description. There's a crypto tab which uses spare CPU power, and there's Liberty mugs which you can use to annoy your coworkers. So feel free to do any of those. And there's also a link of a bunch of other shit that you could do, not the least of which is a flat-out donation system. With all that housekeeping out of the way, we got into this. We've known each other for probably years now, but we got into this conversation where I said I oppose all government, and he said that he generally does too, but he would make the distinction that he would want to live under a small government if he had the choice, even if there was no government like to begin with. So he would create one if there wasn't one yet. So I told him that I would debate him on the utility of that, but I couldn't find a mod for the debate, so this isn't going to be very formal. It's mostly just going to be a discussion. So without further ado, Phil, why don't you introduce yourself, let people know what you do, and let people know what your general ideal society is.
Oh, that's going to be a really tough one for me because I actually am something of an idealist. Well, first of all, I'm Phil Zio. I'm a guy from Pennsylvania, and I run a small, super small, like in the single-digit views podcast with my friend Miles, where every couple of months we sit around, we talk about stuff going on, and we talk about our perspectives on it. It's called the Phil and Mills Podcast, and it's on YouTube, freely available, and it is tiny. Now, with that out of the way, my ideal society is kind of more like an ideal world where people have the ability to voluntarily decide what system they live in without necessarily negative repercussions for changing their society doled out by a world government or whatever. I think that every individual country should be a country based on who in the society wants it to be a country. So if you don't like it, right, you should be free to travel to other countries without necessarily needing something like a visa or whatever. It would more be an application for acceptance.
So if I don't like it, I can leave.
Yeah. Because right now, a lot of people say if you don't like it, you can leave, but that's not necessarily always true because you can't leave the country without government permission.
Well, yeah, and without having to give them more money, and then
Exactly.
give the next government more money so that they can process you into their tax farm. But let me ask you something. How does the idea of a tax farm strike you as the general way society works? Because generally speaking, that's the way a lot of anarchists see it. They see it either
Yeah.
as a tax farm, or they see government as a cancer. We've already got somebody in the comments, Brian Jensen, joking 80% of the tumor is removed. This problem is solved, my friends. Mike the Minarchist surgeon. So I mean, what do you have to say, like, when people tell you that maybe if your solution is small government is just going to turn into a gigantic government again?
Well, that's also why I said before in our conversation that I'm also very voluntarist. So I believe that the people should be able to decide whether or not they're in a location or in a country with government, period. Now, I think that governments sometimes evolve naturally as a result of people wanting things to get done without wanting to do things on their own or wanting to take responsibility for stuff. And I do feel that government is kind of a cop out in that way. But if a small government existed and was run the way that a private company or a private commune was run, where people were actually assigned things and told to do things based on the consensus of what's good for the people, well, that would be a better system than what we have right now in America, at least. So I think that if it's run well, a small government that's focused on one or two things
What are
wouldn't be
those
so
one or
bad.
two things?
I think it comes down to what the people value. So for me, I'd say probably roads and uh, welfare of some kind. So public welfare that could be discerned by the people as being valuable.
So not defense.
Not necessarily. I think if a country wanted to be defense, though, that could be whatever. I mean, I don't care. I believe that the consent of the people is what really matters. So if you don't like the system, you should be free to be allowed to change it, ask to change it without being considered nuts, or you should be allowed to go somewhere else and given the opportunity to make your own system.
Well, so my question is, what do you mean by the people?
Well, I'm talking about the general population. So anybody who lives in a system should have a voice to contribute to it. It may not necessarily be direct democracy, sort of like we live in a republic where we vote on representatives to vote for us, basically. But if somebody wanted to live in a system like that, they could. I'm very much for the free will of the people being allowed to manifest itself in whatever form of government they want.
Well, right. So my question is then, the people, is that a vast majority? Is it 51% of the people? Because the thing is that when people start discussing governments, the
Mhm.
ideal form of government, a lot of the times they'll have this sort of undefined group of individuals that they use as the basis for their statement. They'll say, "We the people." Well,
Yeah.
which people? Like, we the people of the United States, for instance. Which people are you talking about? Are you talking about the landowning white men? Are you talking about the the landowning men of any race? Are you talking about the landowning anybody of any race or gender? Or are you talking about and we could go on about
Yeah.
people who don't own land, people who simply own a car and travel a lot? Who are these the people, and why should they be able to make decisions for everyone else?
Well, that's what I mean is I don't think anybody should have the right to make the decision for anybody else and that every system should be opt out. But that then brings up the issue and the primary concern of a lot of people is if it's opt out, are you still allowed to stay in that place? Well, I'd say it depends on the country's decision. So, in my view, everybody should have a voice in government or a voice in lack of government.
Well, okay, but how do you bring that about when government essentially is a mechanism by which the majority can be funded by the minority, or vice versa?
Mhm.
what's the funding structure like in this government, which is completely opt-outable?
Well, you're gonna think this is probably a straying from the path, sort of, for minarchism. But again, minarchism is just where I'm at right now, and I'm always on the journey, so to speak. But I think Georgism has a good solution to that with a land value tax, where if you're creating value and not taking unsustainably, then your taxes decrease dramatically and it's completely opt in. So, in my view, I like a lot of what Milton Friedman has to say, for example, with universal basic income and all that, but I'm not for enforced structures based on power so much. So, I wouldn't want a government enforcing that. I'd much rather prefer people be given the choice to do it. So, yes, I'd say land value tax is probably the only ethical tax in my view, so long as it's opt out.
Well, then, okay, so I mean, if it's opt out, then how does it actually fund the system if a significant amount of people opt out? And more appropriately, uh, how would you bar people who didn't pay from using the roads, for instance, and
Yeah.
reducing their lifespan? How would you do that and control the roads by a central government while still having it be opt-in? When people opted out, would they simply not be able to leave their house because they would have to eventually cross your grid of government roads that they opted out of? I mean, how does that specifically work in implementation?
Well, that's what I mean is I can't speak for the society that would be implementing this system. So it really comes down to what the people have voted for or have spoken out for and have met with, I'd say, probably close to unilateral uh, decision on. So it's totally idealistic, and I completely understand that. It's not necessarily realistic with what we have right now, but it's my ideal.
So, I mean, on that level,
Yeah.
um, would you then identify yourself as a pragmatic anarchist, where you would want anarchy, but you could understand people choosing not to have it, or do you
Yeah, because not
actively want one
everybody.
of these governments?
I actively want this system, but I'm also pragmatic about it in that I, I'm kind of a realist. I know that this kind of system wouldn't work with the way that our system works right now. It wouldn't work concurrently. Everything would have to change about the way that the world sees governance in order to make this happen. So that's not going to happen, but
Well, right.
it's what I
So,
want.
but my question to you is,
Hmm.
because the basic societal mechanism that runs any sort of free society is trade.
Yeah.
And how in a centrally controlled society where the roads were all paved and controlled by that central authority, would that trade even happen if people opted out? Would they just build parallel roads that overlap somehow? I mean,
Well, in okay, so I've been speaking a lot in the abstract, but for my exact ideal society, right? Not one that other people might, I could conceive of them desiring, but the one that I personally want, I would say that I would want it where the government is explicitly an organization designed for maintenance of roads or bridges and maintenance of, like I said before, one other thing, whether that be, you know, what was the example I gave before?
welfare?
Yes, welfare of the people. I think that they would not have the right to deny people have decided is a public utility is what the government basically maintains but does not have the right to deny. So it's a public utility at that point. It's everybody's property, but you could also build your own private property as well because you can still own land.
Okay, so in that sense, then people are entitled to what they didn't pay for, and other people are still not forced to pay for it. So, what's the incentive for building this society in this way?
Well, I would say a small system where there's just a security blanket. So if some people are paying into it, then you have minimal basic structure provided by the government for roads that would most likely have easy access. And then you could also still have private companies building roads that you could say could be privatized because again it's their property, but could also still be designed for other people in mind. Like, if I were to build a road right now, I wouldn't stop anybody from using it. I would just build it because I want that road for usage.
Well, right. So, but then I mean, if that's the case, then why don't you support a more either communal or syndicalist or mutualist or even anarcho-capitalist way of running roads? Why wouldn't you just support an organization people could voluntarily donate to
Yeah.
for a public access?
I absolutely support that. But I could see it also being a form of government, and I'd think that that would be a little bit more stable.
Well, I mean, why? Why would it
Well,
be more stable if people are simultaneously compelled to pay for it and not compelled to maintain it realistically?
that's a good question. I actually don't know. To be completely honest, it's something I've been thinking about, but I'm not sure.
Because that's the thing. If you have a company that runs, it has to
Hmm.
run and get enough support to get its next funding period.
Yeah.
It has to have
Yeah.
enough support so that it can get its budget settled out. But if you have a government which can compel funding, it can do that regardless of whether or not it made any sort of improvements or progress or had a good product. Um, and people can't opt out. So
Yeah.
if people decided that they wanted to opt out of this structure, I mean, how would these roads even be maintained? I mean, how much of the remaining people who would be funding it would actually be willing to pay for something like roads or welfare or defense or whatever else society claimed to want?
Hmm.
And how much of their paycheck would they be willing to do to throw at it until people in these sorts of institutions had enough to fund it? I mean, because there is a free rider problem in any societal
Yeah.
structure.
There is absolutely a free rider problem, but in my view and my approximation, having it just as a basic safety net where it is opt out, so the default is the tax. And I know that goes against something of some people's view of consent law, basically. But I think if it's standard that you start with that tax set at whatever the people want it to be, and then it's opt out, there will still be people that are willing to pay it based on principle or ideology alone.
So, but they would have to pay progressively more and more until they were effectively just paying for that and couldn't pay for anything else if a significant enough amount of people opted out. So how would the
Mhm.
structure be funded at that point, or would the government just collapse immediately?
Well, at that point, the government would basically have to reevaluate and decide that it's not doing enough for the people, and the people have decided it's not doing enough for them. Now, that's the thing with a single issue government is that it can be torn down and replaced with something else if it doesn't work. I just wanted to be there to start the foundation for a good structure that the people have decided on that it could then eventually be replaced. That's part of why I believe in minarchism and voluntarism, which I was told was completely exclusionary things, but I honestly think that it could work that way if people wanted it, you know?
But what if people didn't want it? What if people didn't want it but wanted to fund another structure? How would this structure preserve itself in the face of overt competition? I
It
mean,
simply wouldn't because the people have decided against it. The people who have the money, who have the spending, decided that they want to fund something else, and that's okay. I honestly think that my ideals are sometimes closer to anarcho capitalism, but I still want to say that it's okay to have government if it's
well,
consensual.
let me just say this. Um,
Yes.
I'm going to form this as sort of a seminarial question. Um, Picture me as a businessman and convince me.
Investing in this, then it's probably the lowest cost possible solution for these roads to be built and maintained. And it's something like a passive maintenance. So the more people want help with the road situation, the more can communally come together and say, we want to provide funding for this. So if you see benefit, right, from having these roads, then there should also be benefit to a passive structure of payment where you can maintain the cost of these roads, be one of many who are maintaining the cost of the roads, and not have to worry about privately calling in a third party who's going to cost upfront a lot more than a passive tax might.
But
So
the competing guy who's competing with your institution here, your road building institution, this guy says that all we have to do is pay a monthly bill of like, $20 or $30. What do you have to say to that? Like, even the richest people can afford that. Even
yeah,
the poorest people can afford that because I'm giving them a good paycheck. So, I mean, why should I hire you and not them?
well, I honestly, if that's the scenario, then I wouldn't. At which point, the road structure of the government wouldn't succeed, and it would be determined that a private enterprise has a better solution to it. But I don't think that we should discount the ability of government to provide a service that is not already being provided as a significant utility by a private corporation.
Well, right, but your competitor has a good story to tell about the roads that he started to maintain after the state collapsed. So, I mean, I'm just wondering what your business has to offer me that this other guy's business doesn't.
Well, nothing at that point. I'm just saying that government should start as a structure and then be replaced by stuff. So, you know,
Okay, and that's why I did the seminarial kind of thing. So,
yeah.
let's let's get specific then. You're making an incrementalist argument. You're saying that you'd eventually like to see anarchy, but you don't think that that's realistic in the short term.
But in the long term, I believe it absolutely could be if we can replace the institutions with effectively safety netted private institutions in the end. So by safety netted, I mean big enough to cover everything that was previously covered by government, because I don't want people to fall through the cracks generously. I'm closer to socialist in that idea, but I'm very much anarchist in my
Right. Okay.
heart.
So and one of the anarchists at heart, who makes a consistent list of good points, Robert Higgs. Brian
Mhm.
also sent one of his quotes, which is, "Minarchists insist the state should confine itself to monopoly control of the military, the police, the courts, the monetary system, and in some arguments, certain essential elements of infrastructure and education." Which is to say, they want the state to have only the full complement of powers required for its establishment and maintenance of tyrannical government. There's a heavy load of wishful thinking being carried here by
Yeah,
people who claim to favor a free society. So I know from what you're saying now that you don't believe all of those things
definitely
should
not.
become compulsorily funded. So let me ask you, if the government isn't funding the military, isn't funding local security, isn't funding education or the courts or creating the monetary system, what are they doing with roads that couldn't be done equally well by the institutions which are funding those things in these future societies?
In the future societies, I would hope nothing. But right now, governments have kind of a monopoly on the road structure because they implement things like tolls and state road systems that create a unified system of roads where the maps are all fairly accurate and they all depict a structure that is interwoven across the entire country, because on a federal level, they have more purview than states do. So it makes sense in our current structure that government has something of a monopoly on roads. But in the future, I would hope that private institutions gain the ability to do it much more cost effectively and have better structures overall. Because, like you've said,
Okay.
I've seen total collapse of a lot of state roads and even routes, like national routes, simply due to the fact that highways were built that had better everything but at a higher cost, and that became profitable for the government. So I definitely see the government running away with its power in a monopolistic sense, and I don't like that at all.
Well, right. So on that level, then, um, what kind of paradigm would arise where people were already paying for things like, essential state services like police and military, where they weren't paying for things like roads as part of the transitionary period. It strikes me that infrastructure would very likely come first in this list, not
Mhm.
last.
Yeah. Um, in my view, a small government is a place that we get to when we're already at the point where we have necessary communities in structure. So a small community or a commune or a uh, like say a village, for example, a couple hundred people that got together decided we should all chip in for a thing, and some people didn't, but they're covered under the purview of the town's budget, basically. So everybody chips into a budget. It's voted on and decided what goes into the budget. And some people say, I don't like that. I don't want to be a part of that. They form their own towns, etc. So, in my view, if somebody were to say, get rid of the need for state or federal police because they now have community police that were trained by the community and they have their own system of laws in place where they say, okay, so we don't agree with a federal law. We don't agree with this law. We don't agree with the state law. We simply want our community to abide by these rules. And anybody who isn't allowed can either be, I don't want to say imprisoned because I do not like the structure of prison. I believe in reform over penitence. But if they were to have communally run police forces and such, they would have no need for federal police. So they can decide what they find to be an affront to their rights, and they can define it for themselves as a community. Then they should have the ability to have communal police forces and no longer have to pay into a federal system where the feds are providing police. I want to see a
Okay.
breakdown in structure to a smaller level where people have more power over their own environments. But at the same time, I don't think we should opt out entirely yet until we have those things in place for a reasonable majority of people. So,
Right. Well,
yeah.
so because there's been a couple things in the news recently. So I'll just go over those things briefly because I
Mhm.
don't want this entire thing to be me sucking corporate cock, and it won't be.
Good.
Um, but Domino's filling potholes in country time, paying kids lemonade stand fines, so that they're not like, so that their families aren't crushed for quote
Oh.
illegal bullshit. You know,
Mhm.
this sort of thing is already happening. And
Yeah.
Finian in the chat here makes the point that private enterprises are already the ones building the roads. The state prevents competition. The USPS is a good example. Police functions are another. As long as government exists, we'll never be able to compete in those services. So, I mean, real like corporations are butting in where they can,
Yes.
but what's to stop corporations from butting into the whole thing if they had the capability to do so? And why not just unleash them?
Well, I think that it's a good idea to unleash them and to prevent monopolization from government. Like you said, what's to stop them? Well, currently, I'm pretty sure there are actually laws against preventing FedEx from having access to an area or things like that, like the United States Postal Service and the Federal Express. But it, I don't think there should be anything stopping them. I do believe that the government should have the ability to uh, provide services when somebody inquires about them or in places where there isn't private enterprise yet. But that would obviously only be a stopgap solution until somebody rises up, so to speak, and makes their corporation or their commune or their organizational structure of choice into the service provider for an area or for even the whole country. Like, I got really upset when General Motors got a bailout a few years ago because now their vehicles are way more expensive. They're paying legal costs. I mean, we're paying their legal costs, and it's not a good situation because we're still paying for a private enterprise that got destroyed and was given basically government handouts to say, yeah, okay, we're going to let you continue even though you're not a good provider, which makes them literally government motors. And I don't know if you agree with that, but it's not good. They're essentially a
Well,
government
right.
institution at this point.
But
So
that's kind of part of the thing, though, is the government
yeah,
uh gets to constrain society to these irrational acts when they become the service provider for social welfare, social good. I
yeah,
mean, Detroit has still been gutted. American jobs are still flying overseas because of all of these regulations.
hmm,
And generally speaking, the cars have become more expensive, but also less efficiently built.
yeah,
Shipped from an overseas factory where people aren't paid as much because of minimum wage laws, things like that. So, I mean, that all just seems like a natural result of government. And it
yeah.
seems to me that when you have a corporation insulated from liability by the state, that's the real problem. And it creates a whole lot of these possible scenarios happening in the first place. So, why would that not also happen with roads?
Because well, I don't know if I mentioned this, but in my ideal society, we would actually be able to constrain the power and limit the power of government, which I
How?
guess is probably the most important thing. Well, revocation of power whenever we decide they are not necessary. So, like we were talking about earlier, if a private enterprise has a better solution that's just way more appealing to the people, the government is no longer funded. They don't get the ability to say, no, you have to pay for it because the majority of people are no longer paying for it. So that's why an opt out system necessarily takes away the power from government when people choose to opt out.
Then why create the extra step of government in the first place? Why not have the average person just have the ability to opt out of whatever contract they're in, which pays for the services that these things fund? Why not have, a system where people can stop going to work if they don't like the way that their boss is behaving or something
Mm-hmm.
similar to that? Um, I mean, realistically, all of these things seem to me like they're very easily solved by not making it as complicated as a government bureaucracy infrastructure would be. So I don't know what the purpose of adding those extra steps is, except possibly to insulate people who can't accept the transitionary process. And if
Mm-hmm.
that's the case, how does the transition begin with to this minarchic society if people aren't ready enough for it to even fund something as simple as the roads?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And to be completely honest, I had always just kind of accepted it as a stopgap solution between the two. So yeah, it's a stepping point from a bureaucratic society to a more open and anarchist society. But you're right. Why would people even go for it if it's sort of a transitionary phase to something they don't want in the first place? Which it's kind of why I've always taken the voluntarist thing and said I'm still that, because even though my ideal is a minarchist transition to an anarchist, I can't figure out a solution personally to what people who don't want an anarchist society are going to do, with the exception of let them have their own society and let us form our own. So I don't know the logistics of that because I don't know how many people would even be open to accepting it at this point.
Well, right. So, and this is my thing. Like personally, I'm a pessimist. I like somebody asked me today. Let me see if I can find the tweet specifically because they asked me today. Basically, why would I try and throw my heart into something that I didn't think would happen? So, I was in a conversation about borders, as would happen.
As always.
Um, and the guy says, what was it? This is where I don't see eye to eye with anarchist. Which, by the way, I mean the guy's following me now, but so I don't want to like rail him or anything, and I really don't mean
Yeah.
this personally, Scotty. If you're watching this, but dude, like I can see when somebody doesn't fully understand a concept when they don't pluralize their plurals, like anarchist, atheist, like they're
Yeah.
always like not plurals, as though the singular there substitutes the whole.
Yeah, it's not a
Um,
monolith, boys. It's literally just groups of people that are not associated with each other but have their own ideas that happen to coincide with a lack of government.
right. Well, and so what I said is this. I said borders are a two-way street. If the world is a community unified against aggression, violent, quote, refugees, aggressive gangs, and other social diseases would be both less pervasive and less difficult to clean up. A
Yeah.
globe against aggression would be a globe without borders, though. And he says, see, this is where I don't see eye to eye with anarchists. You all imagine a perfect world could just instantly arise and ignore very basic human psychology. Evil does exist, you know. If it didn't, we wouldn't have all these problems in the first place. And I said, because I had said this multiple times, I said that I have said multiple times today alone that this won't happen instantaneously. I don't
Yeah.
think it'll even happen at all, but if it does, it'll happen incrementally as a result of a global paradigm shift away from statism and aggression and in favor of freedom. I see apocalypse coming. And this other guy responds, like he quotes me and saying, I don't even think this will happen at all. And he says, it's strange to commit wholeheartedly to an implausible goal. I prefer to live in the land and realm of possibility, which, according to you, has a border or limit, as at least will be anarcho-libertarian non-statists in the apocalypse. And my response to that was the beer clinking emoji, and I said, I just see this ending in rivers of blood and years of darkness. People underestimate the evils of their benevolent masters almost every
Hmm.
time, and the corpse pile will be held together by the bodies of future generations. Cultists can easily get their way if people comply. So that's my general belief. I think this is going to end very badly because people aren't willing to make the transition and because people are very happy in their slavery. So, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that this is just going to like, I'm going to snap my fingers
Yeah.
and then everything's going to be fine. If that was the case, I probably wouldn't do it because like people are still not like mentally transitioned over and they'd probably build a worse government than ever because they just didn't fundamentally know how to deal with shit. Uh,
Exactly.
but at the same time, um, I think that the solution is incrementalism, and I think that it's admitting that it's increments. Because what you were suggesting in the comments section, and the reason that I had you on in the first place, for this sort of pseudo debate thing, because it doesn't have a mod and it's not formal, blah blah blah,
Yeah.
masturbation.
More just like a
Um,
discussion.
yeah. Um, the reason I initially had you on is you saying that you would probably choose to live in a minarchic society if an anarchic society rose up.
Yeah.
You said that you would choose that paradigm even if the anarchist society already existed. So I was curious as to why you would do that. That's the reason I've been phrasing things the way I have.
Yeah.
Like, why would you make that choice? Why would you choose to reverse the incrementalism and essentially create a state where there wasn't one
Mhm.
if the existing paradigm was already anarchist?
Well, that's kind of something that I've been fighting about inside myself to an extent because, like I said, I'm always still on a journey of discovering what I think could be the best possible thing based on new research that comes out
Right.
on like socialist countries and all these other things. Because there was a time when I was a dyed in the cloth, republic loving, uh, American freedom kind of guy, and now I get to this point where I'm like, okay, well, America was never great to the extent that we always had internment camps of some kind. We always had violent, bloody revolution, and that's not something that since I'm not a commie, I'm not a fan of. But it,
Wait, what's wrong with violent revolution?
I'm a peaceful guy. You know, I'm like, I love the idea
Okay,
of
so
discourse.
it's not necessarily that violent revolution would be wrong, even though
Yeah, no.
because of the Smith Act I can't advocate it. Um, Well,
Yeah.
you can watch a video. I have it on my channel where I talk about the Smith Act. It's a really old,
Ugh,
cringy one, but
yeah.
the Smith Act means that essentially we can't advocate taking down a government like the U.S. government. So, I mean,
Which is
there is
insane
that.
because we have the Constitution, which necessitates taking down our government should it become tyrannical.
Right,
So the
right.
Smith Act completely unconstitutional, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah. So then let me ask, um, why would you reverse that? Because like I used to be there. I used to like
Yeah.
well, not exactly there, because like people are unique.
Mhm.
Um, but I used to be there. I used to be a minarchist trying to find the ideal way to fund society with a government. and I'm not anymore because I realized that it went against the fundamental assumptions of my ethics.
Hmm.
So I'm wondering, uh, because you've expressed these ideas in a certain way. What I'm wondering is, if this sort of society existed where we had an anarchic society, if we had already gotten there, which was what you were saying,
Yeah.
how would you sell to enough people the idea of a government that funds roads, um, to get those roads funded?
Well,
What would
like
be
I
your
said,
pitch?
my whole pitch behind that would simply be if enough people want it and you're one of those people, then it could be a small cost. But like you said, if a private corporation does it better, I would want a private corporation to do that, letting the road based government fall to the wayside. But I would want somebody to be allowed to then say, okay, well, I would like a court system that has nationally, like, say we define a certain kind of border for our society, right? A place where my society ends and yours begins. Well, I want to create a court system between the two of our societies, right? That has some degree of crossover based on shared ethics or shared principles. So if I wanted to create a small form of governance for that, that all people opted into, well, it could become an increasingly larger structure. However, I wouldn't want that to last forever. I just want it as a meanwhile in between setup for two different things to come about. One of those things being a system where both of our societies come together in some form and either gel together and coexist well, thus creating a larger society, as is how it works typically, or we completely dissociate from each other and refuse to engage in the same thing. I'm because I'm big on consent. I'm really big on choosing who you associate with.
Right.
So for me, these governments are basically temporary structures and always have a place as a temporary structure before something else comes about as a means of meeting the need of a society before the society figures out a better way to do it.
Okay. So basically, you're insisting that you would try to sell it, and people, even if people probably wouldn't buy it, you would still try to make the pitch, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So my question is, what would promote that? Why would you want to make that sort of pitch if society's already functioning well enough that people are consenting to a system that respects consent?
Oh.
What would be the pitch that you would tell these people in order to get them to possibly buy your product, in this case a state?
Well, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a state so much as, you know what? I actually think it would come off better to explain it as a communal system as opposed to a state. Because you're right, in force, a state necessarily requires force. And so it wouldn't be a state. I've been using the term government, but I think you've kind of opened my eyes a little bit. I don't think it would necessarily be a government so much as a communal corporation.
So that if that's the case, um, first off, you might be interested in syndicalism. Second off,
Yeah.
um, the idea then would be that it would be a series of competing roads-based organizations, and your ideal form of that roads-based organization would be one with regular donations where people could opt out.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot more sense.
Okay, yeah, because that's the thing. Like, I've been in multiple conversations with Georgists, and usually they don't even go this well because the Georgist isn't willing to admit that taxation is fundamentally forceful.
Yeah.
They say that if you can opt out, it's not forceful. Well, that's just like saying, well, if there's a safe word, it's not rape. Like if you tell them that there's a safe word, then it's not, unconsensual for you to do something to them as long as they say the magic word. So
Yeah.
essentially, I'll force you to do something, and unless you do the thing that I'm also forcing you to do, this won't stop.
Yeah. I just like the idea of a unified social structure, regardless of what it is, that can
Right.
provide a service for the people.
Yeah, same. And I used to be a minarchist in that way, and I used to think that the government was the only one capable of doing certain things. But I sort of got to the place in my own mind of realizing that not only was government an inefficient way of doing that, but
Hmm.
the reason it was inefficient is because they were after some sort of compulsory funding and they didn't have to please the public.
Yeah. I think I actually came here from syndicalism because of the idea that we could create a more unified and more efficient form of government. And I thought to myself, wow, that could be really cool if it wasn't so uh, polar opposite to what I actually believed. But again, I've just been kicking it around for a while. I've only really considered myself a minarchist for probably a couple of months because before that, I was, well, a syndicalist with Georgist leanings, and then I just really dove into Georgism. Like, I don't even like value added taxes because as much as a lot of people make the what do you call it, the argument for it based off of the idea that it's the only ethical tax, it's still not an ethical tax to me because there's literally no choice with a value added tax. It's an institution telling you to increase the cost of your goods or services because they determined it would help them survive, which I can't abide by that. So I came here from a place of like, well, syndicalism with maybe a value added to straight up Georgism with minarchist leanings. So,
Well, so let me just say this then. If you're interested in learning more, and if anybody in the audience is interested in learning more, there are many books that I would recommend looking into. And one of the books would be The Machinery of Freedom by David Friedman. It's a relatively good consequentialist approach to supplanting government funded institutions, and that would be more of an anarcho-capitalist leaning.
mm,
Um, there's also What is Property and the Philosophy of Misery by Pierre Joseph Proudhon for a more mutualist view of the world. And then there's Anarcho Syndicalism, which is a book by Rudolf Rocker. And I would
mhm.
recommend all three of these to anybody who's interested in learning about the possible ways of getting government funding, um, without a government. Getting the that was an imprecise way of phrasing it. Getting the things the
Yeah.
government provides without government, and basically all three of them make the essential case that um, if those services are valuable enough to require voluntary funding, um, and they can be successfully funded by that, then they would be funded even if there wasn't a system of compulsion to do it.
Mhm.
And if they aren't, then they shouldn't exist to begin with because there's obviously a benefit mechanism by the masters that fund them.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say my biggest issue with my kind of mutualist, kind of syndicalist, like voluntarist views were always that I believed that people should be able to choose to live in a quote unquote easier system where they can still choose to have a government that operates much like our current one does. But I can't abide by that necessarily because how would we get that system to respect our system without also having a government?
Well, see, that's the thing though. Private businesses insulate themselves from violent competition all the time. That's what
Yeah.
security guards are for. We actually have somebody who's a residential security expert
Ooh.
in the chat here. He regularly discusses um things with me on my streams and gets the perspective of essentially private security. Because he's an anarchist like I am, and he
Hmm.
sees the government as a fundamentally inadequate and inefficient form of provider for these sorts of things.
Yeah.
So, on that level, he says. Free trade zone reminds me of the old cities, but private businesses built and funded the roads. It was in their best interest to do so.
Hmm. I mean,
So I'm Go ahead.
not to bring up like a normie meme at this point, but even Domino's is literally rebuilding the roads so
Well,
that
right.
they can better provide services to the people who are using their delivery service.
Right, because you can't have a good pizza if all the topping gets tossed off by a pothole.
Exactly.
And not to mention that, but they get to put a little billboard in the ground by putting their logo in it. They stamp their logo in it. Like that's the other
Exactly.
part of it. Shit ain't free. And in Domino's worldview, they would benefit more from expressing the fact that they will help even if they're not forced to
Hmm.
than they would by leaving the potholes there to ruin products on the way to their destination. And so Finian says even highways between cities would be built by companies, again, connecting their products to their customers.
Yeah.
And we'd pay for it in higher product prices, but it wouldn't be through extortion at least. And I would argue, by the way, Finian, that because I know you're hearing this, that the prices wouldn't be any higher because fundamentally the prices would just be more specifically and directly funded. Because
Hmm.
the thing is that the reason the prices are so quote low now is because this is a debt system we're on, and it gets to exist based on coercion and evil, and it gets to force the next generation into it. So it wouldn't be any more expensive. It would just mean that the people using it were the ones who paid for it instead of unborn children who aren't even here yet. It wouldn't be a blood sacrifice, it would be
Yeah.
work.
And that would be radically more efficient because you'd have the immediate population telling you that your service is necessary. You wouldn't be staking your future of your company on a potential future generation that may or may not even use or utilize your service.
Especially if this all ends in a big ball of nuclear fire.
Exactly. Then what are you going to do? You've been operating at a loss, kid.
Yeah, well, and of course at that point all the government officials are going to run and hide to their bunkers under the Denver International Airport and shit. So
True. Oh man. And I'd like to say that Milton Friedman, as long as it's been since I was had socialist leanings at all, I'd say Milton Friedman had a really good point when he said that the least effective form of licensure is government licensure, and that the people that privately determine what makes a professional organization or a better business bureau esque type organization, they're going to know what's needed better than a guy who has a pen and a paper and decides, oh, you know what? I've had some people lobbying me for this recently. Let's put this in practice with no knowledge of the fundamentals of the organization that we'd actually have to be making. So it's kind of better to have it as a free enterprise situation anyway, if you're going to have licensure or professional organizations, period.
well, right. And all of these institutions would have to prove their efficacy.
Exactly. And their ethics, because nobody's going to support like a dental association, for example, that's members all believe in zero use of anesthetic. That would be
Right.
like horrendous, and nobody would value that. But if the government said you're a licensed dentist and you don't have to use any anesthetic, uh, the argument would be there for a professional organization to take its place, and government licensure wouldn't be enough at all, period, anyway. So,
Right. Right. Well, and I believe Milton Friedman also said if you put the federal government in charge of the Sahara Desert in 5 years, there'd be a shortage of sand. I think he said something to similar to that.
yeah, he did.
Yeah. So I mean, he understood very specifically that the government is fundamentally inefficient.
Yeah.
So I mean, if he was one of the people that was part of your journey as he was mine, then I could definitely understand not seeing the government as a good arbiter for these sorts of transactions.
Yeah, definitely. I find them extremely inefficient, always based on horrendous deals, right? And terrible overhead. The state of Philadelphia, not the state of Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia spends more money per student for their education system than any other county in Pennsylvania, right? And I'm from Philly, so I've seen it. I went to a really good school out in the suburbs that paid approximately $300 to $400 less than Philadelphia students, but we had everything we needed. We had nice facilities. We had a huge library. We had all this stuff. And wouldn't you believe it? The city of Philadelphia doesn't even have like toilet paper in most of their schools, even though they spend more money per student.
Right.
It's just so
Well,
radically inefficient compared to what our communities have done when making schools that it's unbelievable.
yeah. All right. Well, we're getting close to the amount to the time that we have to leave. So let the audience know what you do again. If you have any specific websites you'd like to plug, you can do that as well. And then I'd like to invite you to also appear on Shit Shooting Sunday. This Sunday we're discussing American imperialism. So if you're interested in that, you could definitely come on the stream. It's at around 6 p.m. Eastern time.
Oh, that would be wonderful, but Sunday's always a really bad day for me. I work all day. Whew.
All right.
So I don't know if I'll be able to make it.
We go from 6 to 9 p.m. Eastern time if you're interested in coming.
At any
So
point during the stream, I could just drop in.
yeah. I mean, as
Oh,
long as
cool.
we haven't filled up the 9-person maximum.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll definitely try to look up for that because Sundays are my family times, my man. But I'm usually
Yeah.
done by 7.
Well, family structure is important, though. Like that's one of the things I advocate is that the family structure should supplant a lot of what the government does. I learned that from Ron Paul.
Oh yeah, dude, definitely. I'm a big family guy myself.
Yeah.
So,
All right.
yeah, I'm
Well,
Phil Zio. I'm an audio engineer from Philadelphia. I do mixing and mastering for bands, all that stuff as my main business. But I also do like live sound. And so audio is my passion and anarchism is my heart. So that's what I do.
very cool. Where can people find you online? Just Facebook? Is that the
Yeah, they
only
can find
place?
me. I have a website, but I don't have a URL for it. So it's like one of those really long .wix site blah 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 things. So eventually I'll have onewallstudio.com, and you can find me on Facebook at Phil Zio or at One Wall Studio, and that's my thing. That's actually the account I'm using right now is my One Wall Studio YouTube account instead of my Phil and Mills podcast one, which I usually save for my political stuff, but this time I just forgot to switch.
Yeah. All right.
So
Well, thank you for coming on. It was a pleasure having you.
absolutely, and it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
And so we'll be closing this out, and then there will be a post-show discussion where you can tag your friends and shit. So this was another episode of the State Smash podcast. Tune in next time, where I think I'll be having on a journalist for the Free Thought Project in Activist Post. So we'll see about that.
Awesome. I'll definitely tune in then.
But be well, everyone, and remember, fuck the state and fuck any system that tries to control you. Be well.